New Orleans Pelicans are a team that's been linked to the Toronto Raptors in multiple trade reports over the past couple days, so we'll break down what those reports had to say as well as the potential players the Raptors could land in a deal with New Orleans. Additionally, we have a Fred VanVleet trade update to discuss, and the asking price for Jakob Poeltl has been revealed, and it is still lucratively high. So lots of stuff to dive into. Let's dive into the first topic of discussion. First thing we're taking a look at is the Pelicans and the Raptors trade reports. Now, the New Orleans Pelicans are a team like the Toronto Raptors that has been widely discussed ahead of this year's trade deadline. And the Pelicans, for this reason, because they have a lot of assets currently on their roster, a lot of young players, but they're also entering that win now mode as one of the top 4 teams in the Western Conference for a large chunk of this season. And with stars like Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram, Zion's been on the court for a large chunk of this year, but they've been winning games even when he's out of the lineup. And Brandon Ingram is a guy that hasn't played since mid-November, right? He's dealing with a toe injury right now, and they've maintained their high level of production. They've maintained being one of the better teams in the Western Conference. So a lot of people predict them to be buyers, especially with all of the draft picks that they have going forward from Anthony Davis and Drew Holiday trades, as well as the young players that they currently have on their roster. And this is essentially what Shams had to say in his one report, essentially saying that if they want to go and get serious with an OG Anunoby or Pascal Siakam trade, then they have all the picks in the world with the eyes emoji. He said this on his FanDuel video that he ended up putting out, but Shams obviously is a guy that's locked in, had a lot of information regarding the Toronto Raptors trade deadline discussions in an article he wrote on The Athletic yesterday, which we covered in yesterday's video. But bringing up the New Orleans Pelicans is particularly interesting because, as said, the Pelicans have a bunch of assets, and they're a team that really could use the services of OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, especially given their current roster construction. Because while Zion and Brandon Ingram, their 2 best players, maybe CJ McCollum's also one of their top, you could debate who's their top 2 guys, but play similar positions as those dudes, they have dealt with a lot of injuries in the past. So having insurance, obviously, as is, integrating Pascal or OG Anunoby to one of those lineups would be a huge plus for that squad, but just adding that insurance if one of them is down with injury, right, to make sure they maintain their level of production as a team, right, is a huge plus there. And then they could bring Jonas off the bench and then sort of reconstruct their lineups when they're fully healthy. But they're not the only 2 guys that could be brought up that Shams discussed, and I know it's coming from a sketchy reporter in Scoop B who's really lost all of his credibility with some of the things that he said in recent years, but he's essentially reported that the Pelicans are one of the teams that have shown interest in OG Anunoby and Gary Trent Jr. So take everything Scoop B says with a grain of salt. The only reason I'm bringing it up is because Shams also named the Pelicans as a potential trade suitor with the Toronto Raptors, but essentially what he's saying is that they're interested in Gary as well, which makes sense given they do have a lot of young guys. They have a lot of quality sort of wing prospects on the New Orleans Pelicans. They're not necessarily win-now guys, even if they could develop into those types of players. And the Raptors might be more willing to take on some of those prospects, especially with some draft capital, whereas the Pelicans might be willing to take a Gary Trent Jr. who's more polished and more suited to more apt to help winning now. And looking at the Pelicans roster, they have a lot of, as I said, draft picks, but as well as young players. And one of the guys that really intrigues me is Dyson Daniels. Now, you're looking at his stats and you might say, Ben, why the heck do you want a guy that's averaging 4 points, 3 rebounds, 2 assists? 36% from the 3-point line is pretty solid, but he's a dude that I think really fits the Toronto Raptors mold. He's 6'8", he plays the point guard position, he's really fluid, he was a lottery pick this year, and he's only 19 years old and just oozing with potential, right? He is a guy that, you watch from the eye test and you can clearly see could develop into something great in the modern NBA. So obviously, it's too much of a risk to give up just straight up, in my opinion. Gary Trent Jr. or Fred VanVleet or whatever you're talking about, but he could be a cool, nice piece in a potential package where a lot of assets come back to Toronto. Obviously, the salaries would have to match, but there's also some other guys that would be cool to bring in on the Toronto Raptors. Another one is a guy that's sort of lost a little bit of his value this season because he hasn't grown in the area some people thought he would, but Herb Jones is a lockdown defender, averaging 10 points per game, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 1.5 steals. The 3-point percentage is below 30%, which would be a little bit of would need to improve in that area. But again, a guy that can certainly develop. And if we're going in that retooling, rebuilding direction, would be an awesome role player to bring in. And probably the most encouraging guy, because he kind of fits the needs of a Toronto Raptors team right now, is Trey Murphy. Because Trey Murphy III, averaging 13 points, 4 rebounds, probably would be a guy the Pelicans would really want to let go of if they're trying to win now, but shooting 40% from the three-point line, and it's really stepped up this season when they've dealt with a lot of injuries. So, he would be a real centerpiece, a really nice player to get back. Also, as a young dude, right, early in his NBA career for the Raptors. And if you want to buy low on one of these Pelicans players, take a look at like a Jackson Hayes or something, who the stats are absolutely bad this season, but he hasn't been getting a lot of run. He doesn't fit really what the Pelicans are doing this year, especially where they brought in JV recent seasons. So, Hayes, he's a big man, long, wiry, could be, again, a nice flyer for the Toronto Raptors. But if we're getting picks back and we want young players, if we're going in that retooling, rebuilding direction, then the Pelicans definitely have some players, a lot better pieces than some other teams would be potentially be able to give to us. But let me know what players you'd be interested in trading for the New Orleans Pelicans. Obviously, it's tough to give up a guy like OG. We need a haul of first-round picks coming back if it's either OG or Siakam going in one of those deals along with some of these young guys. But I don't know. It's pretty interesting stuff. And if you're confident in your predictions, your takes on where the Toronto Raptors players could land following this year's trade deadline, definitely check out the CoolBet app. They have some custom odds. They have some custom bets for Toronto Raptors fans about our specific players. You can see them on the screen there right now. Where the players might land. Pascal, OG Anunoby, Fred VanVleet, and Gary Trent Jr. will land following this year's trade deadline. I don't see the Pelicans. Where are the Pelicans popping up? Right, these are adjusted. The Pelicans are there for Fred VanVleet, but you can bet on this. You make some money if you're fairly confident in your takes. CoolBet is a sports book. They're regulated in Ontario. They're available all across Canada, and they give you the best. They give you great odds on Toronto Raptors games, NBA games, really any sports you're interested in betting in general. So if you are interested in betting, definitely use the CoolBet app using our link down in the description. Helps us out big time. So shout out to CoolBet for supporting the channel. But the next thing we're taking a look at is Fred VanVleet trade update. Now, Fred VanVleet is a guy that a lot of Raptors fans have been all over the map with, or a lot of people are in the not loving Fred VanVleet at this point in his in this season, given his low field goal per shooting percentage and all that's his regression on the defensive end since last year's All-Star game. And while my concerns are definitely I feel the concerns that a lot of Raptors fans have with Fred VanVleet, especially in regards to his defensive regression. I'm not a guy that's sold on scapegoating Fred VanVleet for all of the Raptors' problems this season. So that's why I've maintained the stance that I don't really want to give up Fred VanVleet for nothing. Yes, if we can get a good package back for him, especially where he's a free agent, he's going to look for a lot of money this summer. I wouldn't be opposed to a trade for Fred VanVleet, but I'm not in the camp of we immediately need to sell this guy for nothing. And even though he's been putting up high 30s in recent games, Raptors fans are still calling this guy trash and stuff. But to a lot of Fred VanVleet's haters' dismay, Michael Grange came out with a little report where he discussed the Fred VanVleet situations. Obviously, Grange is a beat reporter, insider for the Toronto Raptors. Basically, he had to say Fred VanVleet is not used to having his name rumored in potential players on the move, but in the midst of a subpar season by his standards and with a chance to be a free agent this summer, the Raptors veteran might as well get used to it. Is he being traded to Orlando? No. So Grange is essentially shutting down those rumors that have been discussed by Shams and all that. The Magic have the money to sign him in free agency if they want to. Although Orlando did have some of its basketball operations staff members on hand in Milwaukee, so apparently, so Grange is coming out and giving us some little insights, little nugget, even though he's saying that, he's not going to get traded to Orlando. Apparently, there were some Orlando scouts, or Orlando front office people watching Fred VanVleet play in Milwaukee, or watching the Raptors Bucks games, so getting an in-person look, which is very, very interesting. Even though Grange is saying that no deal trade would go down with Orlando, the free agent talk from Shams definitely seems valid if their staff, their members of their organization are watching him play the same way that the Clippers did with Kawhi Leonard a few years ago. But goes on to say that, is he going to Phoenix? It's hard to see a fit there. either by trade or via free agency. And would the Dallas Mavericks like to add Fred VanVleet replacement since the departed Jalen Brunson? Sure, but do the Mavericks have the players the Toronto Raptors want? Will there be big deals, small deals, and what about Gary Trent Jr.? Goes on to say, Grange is shutting down a lot of these potential deals happening, so Grange doesn't expect a big blockbuster deal happening for Fred VanVleet. I've sort of made that prediction as well. I don't really think a deal with Fred or Siakam will necessarily go down this year in my cool bet predictions, but we'll see what ends up happening. We'll see what ends up happening as we inch closer and closer to this year's trade deadline, but Fred VanVleet, do you think he'll be on the move? It's pretty interesting that Orlando Magic execs were out there watching him play, live, or at least watching the Raptors immediately after all of that reports from Champs came out. But the next thing we're taking a look at is a wild asking price for Jakob Poeltl. Now, Poeltl's a name that's been floating around Toronto Raptors trade rumors for a very long time, pretty well since he's been traded, since he's been sent away. The Raptors have been trying to reunite the Yak and Skills front court, but we have the asking price revealed for Jakob Poeltl, and it's not looking that feasible for the Toronto Raptors right now. As according to the Athletics' Jared Weiss, the San Antonio's price tag for Poeltl is high, as the team has made it known that to interested parties throughout the league that it will seek 2 first-round picks in exchange for the 7-year veteran. And the article goes on to say the Raptors continue to have significant interest in acquiring the 27-year-old who could become an unrestricted free agent this summer. Now, Jakob Poeltl, we brought up his stats a lot this season. This guy's averaging, roughly 10, and 8. I don't have his stats memorized off the top of my head. Not much of a three-point shooter, but is a very strong positional defender, blocks shots. It's just a solid center the Raptors could certainly use into their lineup. But 2 first-round picks, especially considering our record right now, is kind of in the downward trajectory as well as bad in its own right. We're not looking too hot there in the Eastern Conference, right? It doesn't make sense for us to give up a first-round pick this season. Maybe if we give protections on it, playoff protections, then we could scoop up Jakob Poeltl for free or something like that. Then maybe Masai could finesse, but I don't know. I think if we're going to get Jakob Poeltl, given this asking price, or unless the Spurs become desperate, we look to acquire him in free agency this summer. But let me know what you guys think about a potential Jakob Poeltl trade. And the final thing we're discussing is Kevin Garnett giving high praise to Scottie Barnes. Now, Scottie's received a lot of criticism over the season, even though he's been really amping up his game as of late, right? He's kind of shaking off those sophomore year slumps. And Kevin Garnett came out on Twitter. He had a bunch of words, but I'll just highlight this tweet here, saying that Scottie Barnes is a young OG, not the elder statesman or the most or has the most accolades in Toronto, but he's the heart and soul. OG and the next up. I know about that. Keeping it 100. So KG's throwing out some support there for Scottie Barnes. Obviously had a big game against the Knicks recently. I thought played solid in the game against the Milwaukee Bucks. And, I'd be loving some Scottie Barnes praise. I love when players are giving him some love. Now, has Kevin Garnett had the greatest accuracy predicting stars in the past? Maybe, maybe not. He was high on Towns. He was high on Thon Maker as well. But, anyone that's showing love to Scottie Barnes, you love to see it. But folks, you guys are the best for making this far. Let me know in the comment section below what trades you think will go down. And subscribe to the channel. We're almost at 27,000 subs, so definitely hit that sub button. It would really mean the world to me. And check out the Cool Bet app. It helps us out big time. But you guys are the best. I'm signing out.